Welcome to the ThePPod.
Right, hello and welcome back to the ThePPod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Now, as you know, as part of these podcasts, we like to explore the various facets of safeguarding in the county and nationally. And I'm really pleased today to be joined with a real expert in his field today, and that is the Local Authority Designated Officer, or LADO. And here I have one of the LADOs with me today, Anthony Goble. So, Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Steve. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a real pleasure, and I know we've spoken over many years and sort of done a piece of work together. So it's great to finally get you in the studio and gain your kind of knowledge, if you like, around this quite specific kind of role, isn't it?
Very specialised.
So let's get stuck into it then, if we can. And for anybody who's not familiar with the role of the LADO, or Local Authority Designated Officer, could you just kind of explain what that role is and kind of the roles and responsibilities of it?
So back in 2002, two children, 10-year-olds, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, living in a village in Cambridgeshire, one Saturday went round to see in the village where they live their teaching assistant, a lady called Maxine Carr, and she wasn't there. The door was opened to them by a man called Ian Huntley, and he murdered the two girls. What came from that was a huge change in child protection legislation, and the child protection system, I think, from that tragedy recognised the importance of seeing that abuse and harm of children can be perpetrated beyond the family.
So this was known at the time as the Sower murders, wasn't it? And I think quite a famous kind of case because of the changes that it led to.
That's right. Ian Huntley being a caretaker at the local secondary school, and as I said, Maxine Carr was a teaching assistant. And what the public inquiry recommended in terms of legislative changes also included the need for there to be a procedure that dealt with people who work with children and young people who have acted inappropriately and caused harm. And when we talk about people who work with children and young people, it's what we call the widest children's workforce. So we're talking people who work in a paid role, social workers, teachers, police, and all the way through on the continuum to people who give of their own time to volunteer for organisations that run activities and events for children and young people, such as sports, scouts, that sort of thing. So
it's quite a specific role that you have. Been in this role in Somerset, how long now? 8 years?
Yes, I joined in 2015 alongside the LADO assistant Julian Flack. He joined at the same time, and we've subsequently been joined by Stacey Davis.
Yeah, which is brilliant, having two LADOs for the first time. Not that there was nothing wrong with just having you, Anthony, but I know that you've been absolutely rushed off your feet capacity-wise for a number of years now, haven't you?
Yeah, it has been busy because primarily because of organisations and agencies understanding their responsibility to report allegations against their staff or volunteers, but also we've been promoting the managing allegations procedure to a wider audience. So we're well known now, and organisations and agencies understand their responsibilities. The role of the LADO, which is a statutory role, is there to be the first point of contact when there are allegations against people who work with children and young people. We receive those notifications, as we call them in Somerset. We assess, we determine how much of a risk the adult of concern presents. We give advice to employers about how to manage that risk, and we work closely with police and children's social care colleagues to ensure that if their thresholds are met, there may be a role for those agencies.
So it's quite a specialist role there, isn't it? And quite a niche role in terms of the work that you do. But so it's sort of in a nutshell, it's about if somebody has concerns, has safeguarding concerns about an adult working around children, actually you're the kind of facility then, in conjunction obviously with other partners like the police, like you mentioned, to really kind of explore that and look at the safeguarding around that child and potential risk of that adult.
That's right. The statutory guidance working together has 4 criteria to determine if the inappropriate behaviour of that person who works with children and young people has been met, and those criteria are that the inappropriate behaviour has harmed or may have harmed the young person, that it may be a criminal offence against or related to the young person. The 3rd criteria is that the person poses a risk of harm to the young person, and the 4th criteria looks at someone who may be unsuitable to work with children. So that 4th criteria has been introduced in recognition of professionals outside of their work setting behaving inappropriately, and there may be a transferable risk back into their day job.
Because that came was it 2020, I believe?
Yeah, just before COVID, before the pandemic.
So did you find, because obviously that 4th category is quite a bit broader in some respects, and say indicates they may pose a risk of harm. So there's a couple of kind of broader aspects within that. Did you find from that point that in terms of notifications to yourself, those really escalated as a result of that, or did you not see much of an impact from it?
It's about promoting the fact that 4th criteria had been introduced, but as the managing allegations procedure with those 4 criteria are promoted, not just here in Somerset, but around the country where local authority designated officers work for local authorities. Yeah, we're beginning to see a much greater awareness of people's behaviour, i.e. inappropriate behaviour, and how that might impact on the children and young people that they come across in their professional role.
And we'll talk probably, I'm sure, as we go through this about sort of that kind of pragmatic approach and looking at context and things. But I think that 4th category, like you say, that transferable risk is quite a sensible way forward, like you say, because there are times where somebody may not be directly posing a risk of harm directly to a child, but actually there might be something you think, actually, do you know what, this behaviour over here, maybe outside of the workplace, maybe not even related to children, actually that could draw into a real question about their suitability to be around children.
Absolutely. Because when we're looking at inappropriate behaviour, I think that it's far greater than the actions of the individual or the inactions of the individual where they may have been negligent. We're also looking at individuals' values, attitudes and beliefs. So if an individual spends their spare time supporting banned organisations who are out there to radicalise young people, that would be a concern if they are working in their day job with children and young people.
So what are sort of typical things that you see coming into you on a kind of daily basis? I know I'm presuming there isn't an average day within your role.
Never an average day, lots of variety.
So what are the kind of things that you see coming your way?
So in no particular order, we see incidences where professionals have breached what we call personal professional boundaries,
right?
Where perhaps they've made contact with the young person outside of normal working hours. There may be sinister motives to that. There may not be. If there's not sinister motives, then certainly they've acted outside the expectations of their employer's code of conduct. We see cases coming through around inappropriate physical contact, so the use of force and needing to determine whether the force used was necessary, was it reasonable, was it proportionate, where risk managing professionals who are subject to criminal investigations, so where police colleagues notify us of investigations into criminal offences and have identified that the suspect works with children and young people. We deal with sexual assaults, we deal with grooming type behaviour,
right? And
we're dealing with trauma-based allegations that have been triggered for children looked after. So if the behaviour of a residential care worker or a foster carer has been inappropriate and triggered trauma for that young person, there may be a need to go through a process to identify what that's about and how to ensure it doesn't happen again.
And are there agencies that you have sort of more contact with or less contact with? And you mentioned their foster carers and residential children's homes, and the police there, obviously, if there's been criminal offences towards children.
Well, it's probably two answers to that. There's the agencies and organisations that send notifications through, and here in Somerset, because of the high number of schools that we have, we probably get 40% of our notifications coming from schools. That's academies and independent schools as well as maintained schools. We've got a lot of residential children's homes in Somerset, so that takes up probably a third of the notifications coming through. And then we're talking about foster carers and other organisations, community voluntary sector organisations, youth groups, scouts, and all the different activities, extracurricular activities that young people get involved with.
Yeah. I was just thinking as well, we were talking just before we started recording this about the Lucy Letby inquiry, and obviously the deaths and the harm that she caused within the health system. Is that the sort of thing that you'd be involved in as well, potentially?
Very much so. The definition of someone who works with children and young people, as I said in my introduction, is broad in its definition. So certainly Lucy Letby was a paediatric nurse, and she was responsible on her shifts on the neonatal unit for some very vulnerable babies, and concerns were raised by colleagues of Lucy Letby, including paediatricians. That would normally, you'd expect that to be reported to the LADO, who would then liaise with the police and children's social care and the acute trust in terms of determining the processes to follow to investigate that.
No, thank you, because I think it's important to clear out, because I think sometimes people may see your role, like say, to do with schools or to do with children's homes, but actually it's broad, isn't it? As broad as it is wide, and like say, including any agency that has any contact with children, young people at all.
Yes, and when you think we've got 110,000 children, young people in Somerset, who 24/7 are involved in living their lives, and hopefully it's a happy and safe life. They are going to come across people outside their family setting who might be intent on causing them harm. So,
and you mentioned obviously within the LADO service, there's yourself, there's Stacey Davis, the other LADO, and Julian Flack, who's the LADO assistant. So a team of three of you?
There's three of us. It's interesting. We're an interesting mix, but we blend well and harmonise well. I come from a human resources background, so I'm sort of steeped in employment processes, employment policies, recruitment and retention, codes of conduct, anything around employment law. And of course, we're dealing with employers every day. Stacey comes as an experienced social worker, so she brings a really helpful background and experience and perspective about the social care system and children and young people, how they develop, how we support, nurture. And Julian, who joined when I arrived, has over the last 8 years developed outstandingly into an integral part of the team. We couldn't do it without him.
And what sort of volume are we looking at here in terms of the number of notifications? What are we talking about? Sort of a couple a year or something, or more than that?
We're probably receiving each year 600 to 700 notifications.
Right.
Not all of those are the most serious. In fact, probably a third of those 600 to 700 we assess as not needing our involvement.
Wow.
Now, that's not to say it's not a serious issue, that it's not a concern, that there needs to be a process followed to investigate. It just means it doesn't get picked up under the managing allegations procedure.
So just to pick that apart, so 600 to 700, so on average, 2 a day.
Your maths is better than mine.
Well, I'm thinking very quickly. I said roughly, that's my catch-all with that one. But so that's a big number, isn't it? And for sort of three of you within the team, that's a lot to deal with. And is that something you've seen increase over time in terms of notifications?
It has increased. It's increased primarily because we're promoting the managing allegation procedure with organisations and agencies. That includes, of course, the training that you undertake with the multi-agency Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And as people who've got safeguarding responsibility as part of their remit understand that part of that responsibility is to report individuals who work with children and young people, we're seeing a year-on-year increase.
And you said that so out of if we just take 700 as a number, then so out of those 700, how many do you say would roughly be sort of picked up by yourselves?
We would probably run with 2/3 of those.
Okay,
and a third we would consider as not meeting the 4 criteria I mentioned earlier.
So what with those that don't meet your criteria? What are the sort of things that you see coming up within those?
What I suppose is described as low-level concerns.
Right.
I mentioned earlier about blurring personal professional boundaries. I mentioned conduct. So most organisations will have a code of conduct, which is around the expectations of what's acceptable professional behaviour with the young person and what's not. So we will look at cases that are coming through of that ilk, and yes, that it is concerning behaviour. Yes, they appear to have breached their own organisation's policy and procedure, e.g. their code of conduct, but we've assessed that the incident, particularly if it's a one-off, doesn't necessarily indicate that person poses a risk of harm to young people. But nonetheless, they have to be held to account. So there are other processes that can be followed without triggering the managing allegations procedure.
Yeah, and I think that's important. Obviously, I joined some of your training yesterday. We'll talk about low-level concerns in a bit, if that's okay. But and it was very much about just sort of understanding, okay, yes, some things are completely appropriate to notify yourselves over. And again, when we're looking at safeguarding, it's about that risk to that child. And so there's quite a broad spectrum within that of behaviours which, like I say, may not be appropriate behaviours around children and young people. They might be a breach of code of conduct, professional boundaries, but actually wouldn't meet that sort of criteria of harm, I guess, to follow that sort of procedure through with yourselves.
Absolutely, because we spend a lot of our time assessing notifications that come through and, in effect, gatekeeping what is going to be picked up under the managing allegations procedure, because there's a recognition that people who work with children and young people are human beings. And like all of us, we make mistakes, and that includes accidents that happen that sometimes even cause harm. Sometimes we can be reckless in our behaviour at work. Sometimes there's deliberate intent and a motivation to harm. So a lot of gatekeeping around what are we dealing with here? What the actions or inactions of that individual professional / volunteer, where does it sit? Have they simply made a mistake? Is it accidental? Or are we seeing something more motivated by deliberate intent to harm? And research tells us, particularly when we look at cases that generally make the headlines, which is around sexual harm of children and young people, we have to determine whether we might be seeing an emerging pattern of concerning behaviour. So that's where, from research, we know that people who set out to deliberately sexually harm children and young people, they develop an interest in children and young people, and it may be several years before they actually perpetrate the harm. On that journey, they will try to push boundaries, and it's those that get reported to us that we will keep on our database as a cross-reference for future notifications on that individual, because research tells us that if someone could just see over that journey of that individual's career, those low-level incidences that at the time may not have needed reporting to the LADO service, possibly didn't even need to be dealt with formally by the employer at the time. They may have been given us a quiet word, but when they are captured and you look at the accumulated effect, it supports the research that shows that could be someone on a journey with an outcome that they are going to harm a young person. So it's a collation of appropriate data to see about that emerging pattern, to identify it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think there's a risk sometimes with emerging patterns where, and I'm sure you see this, of kind of normalization of behaviours and accepted normal. I was thinking as you were talking just then, and it's quite an extreme example in a way, but thinking about Jimmy Savile, where actually the behaviours that he very, very publicly exhibited were really, really concerning. But over a long period of time, there was very much this kind of normalization of this behaviour. I remember watching a documentary by Louis Theroux, where he went back and kind of reviewed the documentary he did with Jimmy Savile at the time, and saying actually when he looks back on it now, it was so normalised, the behaviour that he was doing, even in the interviewing, that he was kind of pulled into it. It's just Jimmy. It's just what he does. It's just. Whereas actually, if you look at what he's doing now in retrospect, which is always a luxury in a way, but actually what he was saying was very, very blatant sometimes. But the normalisation of that, and I think if we kind of boil that down to a much smaller level, when we look at agencies where people may have known each other for many years, or that kind of normalising is a real risk, isn't it?
When we're looking particularly at sexual harm, it's a recognised pattern of people to groom those that are there to protect. So that will generally start with their co-workers and managers, where they work very hard to be charming, to be loyal, to be committed to their work, and to build trust. That's the key. That if they can build trust with their peers, that opens up opportunity to target victims. And the cases like Jimmy Savile, he manipulated the system because he had status. He was, with that status, was the popularity that gave him a lot of power, which he manipulated. And of course, he, as a celebrity, he was earning the BBC a lot of money. That makes it very difficult for any organisation in the face of that popularity, where he was probably at the time deemed a national treasure. Makes it very difficult to try and buck the trend and to challenge inappropriate behaviour. So yes, that normalisation isn't something that just happens. They work hard. Perpetrators of sexual harm will work hard to have people trust, and that comes from that normalised behaviour.
And we talk about grooming of children often, don't we? But like you say, grooming of adults, of those protective factors around those children is absolutely key to understand as well. And I think sometimes we have to be honest, we sometimes have these images of people who intentionally seek to abuse children and what they look like. We've got that sort of unconscious bias of we would instinctively feel very uncomfortable around them. We would instinctively know, they would be kind of slimy, uncomfortable, awkward people, which would got our kind of spider senses tingling, going, no, this person isn't right here. But actually, what we see a lot of, like you've just mentioned, are people who would be that very reliable person, that go-to person, the person that everyone says, oh, they're great. They're always kind of, always stepping in at the last minute to help out.
Yes, the research on people who have been working in positions of trust crosses the whole of society. Yes, statistically predominantly men, but a not insignificant number of women. There's no race divide. There are people from faith backgrounds, no faith backgrounds. They can be young, they can be old. If we think of the Jamie Bolgers of this world, he was murdered by two young people. We think of Vanessa George, who worked at Little Ted's nursery in Plymouth, who was part of a paedophile ring. We've got doctors, we've got police officers, we've got all sorts of different people from society. There's no one fit for someone who's got deliberate intent to go out and harm.
What happens then? What's the process? I think for yourselves, there's I guess, two typical routes into yourself. One through the police, and potentially one from an employer, a member of the public, sort of anybody else. So can you sort of talk us through what happens?
Sure. The expectation, most of the notifications will come from organisations, sometimes from the public, and we're more than happy to accept notifications wherever they come from. But, of course, the public aren't as well versed in the role of the LADO or the managing allegations procedure. So generally we try to promote it with designated safeguarding leads in all organisations and agencies. The expectation is if they feel that any of the 4 criteria I mentioned earlier are met, only has to be one, doesn't have to be all 4. The expectation is within 1 working day they need to submit what we call an allegations reporting form, which in Somerset is how you get in contact with the LADO service. That's available on the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership website. And they email that form through to Somerset Direct. That then gets logged and we assess and make contact with the notifier, usually within 1 working day.
And I guess from that point, it then kind of branches out depending on the response, depending on the situation. But I would guess probably a bit of fact-finding, maybe initially, kind of liaising with police and others.
Absolutely. We save employers a lot of time because we take on the responsibility to liaise with the police and children's social care. The exception being is if a child or young person is a risk, imminent risk,
right,
then we'd expect a phone call straight through to the police. But by and large, we will liaise with the police colleagues and children's social care in order for them to determine from the information in the allegations reporting form if their threshold's met to become involved. And we work collaboratively and have a really positive working relationship on a daily basis and work together in the best interest of the child and young person. Primarily, employers will always be expected to follow their own internal process, but we will advise them at what point they can do that. Last thing we want to do, if it's a particularly serious matter, is jeopardise child protection inquiries by children's social care and or criminal investigations by the police.
That's a lot of decisions making to make in a very short space of time, isn't it?
And with very limited information.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It is.
So with I'm just thinking in terms, how do you prioritise that? You know, if we're looking at 600 to 700 a year, that's a large volume coming into you, and within that decision making process that you've got to make quite quickly. You know, how do you kind of prioritise that in terms of what you do?
Well, we work really to the statutory agency's thresholds. So we're working to significant harm, which if children and young people have got an acute need, and that acute need is they need to be kept safe because they are experiencing or maybe likely to experience significant harm, we know immediately that threshold has been met, and we know immediately that there's a role for our colleagues in children's social care. So we'll liaise with the front door, the first response team, and they will pick up the case and proceed to convene a child protection strategy discussion if necessary. And similarly, we simultaneously liaise with our police colleagues because we've got enough depth and breadth of experience to determine if potentially a criminal offence has been committed, and want the police to very much pick it up and run with it as quickly as possible.
And you mentioned the allegations reporting form there, who I know, because we can't resist acronyms, I know you refer a lot to as the ARF on that. So that's kind of one of the main kind of routes into yourselves, the allegations reporting form. What are some of the things that you look for when you receive that? And is there anything that's particularly helpful or unhelpful that's sort of included in there? You said quite often there's not a lot of context, maybe.
Yes, we have a mantra in our service, context is everything. And context can explain whether we're talking about something that may have been an accident, one-off, or that there's something more sinister. But what we're looking for is, apart from the context, is we need to understand the organisation's perspective of the incident. Are they telling us that they have concerns? What is the concern that they have? Are we talking about a flagrant breach of their policy or not? We would want to know information about their employee or volunteer, which is how long they've worked for the organisation, because that would determine if they have gone through their induction and probation and received the necessary training that they should have had. Age plays a part in terms of we would expect people with more lived experience to perhaps have a better appreciation of what's expected. We will look for whether disability needs to be factored in, and their ethnic background can play an important part. If we're dealing with, for instance, people who English is not their first language, it could be that the young person making the allegation has misinterpreted what's been said to them. Then in terms of the child, we need to know what their particular needs are. We're very aware of the fact that research tells us that statistically children who are disabled are much higher and more likely to be at risk of harm.
I joined your training yesterday, and there's an example given there where, just to give that example for a moment, so a report comes into you that a member of staff working in a school, just for example, has grabbed a young person by the hood of their coat and yanked them backwards, and they've caused marks and bruising on their neck. Now, that by itself, I think people would probably agree that's concerning. And potentially, when we're looking at that criteria of harm, has it caused harm to a child, and has it possibly committed a criminal offence? You could look at those criteria and say, yeah, actually, there are marks to that child's neck, and actually, it's completely inappropriate. But then, if you're looking at context, the context could be that child was about to run straight out onto a dual carriageway in front of a lorry, and that member of staff very quickly acted to grab that child as quick as they could and pull them back off the road. In which case, the context, you'd say, perhaps that was completely appropriate behaviour. Is that the kind of thing you see sometimes? So that out of context information? Yeah,
very much so, because the headline concerns, if just taken as that summary, youngsters inappropriately physically grabbed and is physically hurt, that headline would indicate something very concerning. The context, however, brings us back to what I was saying earlier, that as a service we're empathetic to the fact that those that work with children and young people, by and large, are decent, hard-working, committed, passionate people about meeting the needs of young people. So we would look at that context to determine whether or not this incident could be deemed to either be accidental or reckless or deliberate. Now, in the scenario you've just given, it's deliberate, but it was a deliberate act where the collateral damage, for want of a better term, was far outweighed by the actions of the professional to stop the young person being a fatality.
And you could argue, I guess, that if they didn't take that action, then it would be a neglect of duty of care.
Very much. Neglect and duty of care is a good example of many of the notifications that we come through, and that's when context becomes important, because there can be circumstances and occasions where a professional clearly is in breach of their organisation's policies and procedures, and there we might look at the context as to why they've done what they've done.
There's a lot you're dealing with here on a daily basis. What would you say, if you could really boil it down, what would you say are some of the really kind of key challenges for yourself and the LADO service, and some of the big complexities of what you work with?
I think the child protection system as it exists in this country at the moment is very adversarial. It's very blame focused. I think regulatory bodies add to that. That causes a lot of managers, head teachers to feel that they've got to immediately report to the LADO all instances of inappropriate behaviour. And yet the statutory guidance is very clear about using common sense.
Right.
It's important to look at context. It's important to consider what was driving the actions of that person, that adult of concern, before determining the need to send in a notification to the LADO service. So we're very much working hard to promote and encourage and help people in decision-making roles to have the confidence to look at a concern and determine what's the most appropriate process to investigate and deal with that concern. And it's not always the managing allegations procedure or the role of the LADO that necessarily has to be followed. It depends, as we often say, it depends. There are different processes and procedures that most organisations have in place that can, in a very similar way, investigate and hold an individual to account.
Do you find that actually some of the time people are contacting you because they want you to make that decision? Because that sort of pressure of, I've got to be fulfilling my responsibilities under Ofsted and everybody else, and I've got these real pressures to make sure I'm ticking all the boxes. I know this doesn't meet the criteria, but actually, do you know what? I need Anthony to make this decision for me.
Very much so, but it's a scary old world out there, and we respect the fact that people who've got that responsibility as part of their role to report concerns are working in high-pressured environments, lots of demands on them, and with very little time to do what they do. So we are always empathetic, and we have designed the notification form, the ARF, the Allegations Reporting Form, in such a way that if they're not sure any of the 4 criteria are met, they can just simply ask for advice and guidance, and we're always happy to provide advice and guidance, and our time commitment to turn that round is within 5 working days. We work hard not to make decisions on behalf of others whose responsibility it is to that individual of concern. Primarily that's an employer, if I use that generic term to cover organisations where there are volunteers, like the Scouts. It is ultimately for them to assess the concern and collate all the information as part of an investigative process, and to determine what level of sanction, if any, to put in place for that individual. And sometimes there's no sanction. Sometimes it's a recognition that perhaps to a degree the organisation's culpable because they haven't adequately ensured that individual's familiar with its own policies and procedures. It might be that those policies and procedures are not particularly fit for purpose. Possibly the individual hasn't received the requisite training that they should have received. So the employer has to take into account all of those factors as well if they're a reasonable employer that values their staff.
You mentioned induction earlier on in this podcast, and I think that's always really key as well. I think there's a real risk sometimes that we just kind of assume that people know things, particularly, like say, if they're younger, if they've not worked in this field of work from very long, just kind of an assumption that people just kind of understand what professional boundaries are. Yeah, what does that look like? And from what you said in terms of sort of conduct, is that something you see coming in quite a lot?
Absolutely. It's naive of organisations to think that a professional who's an experienced professional coming from a different employer is going to immediately understand the culture of their new employer, to understand the expectations around what's considered appropriate behaviour and what's not. So these many complexities that need to be taken into account. You can't just pick a professional doing a similar role elsewhere or in another country and think that they will slot in immediately into our own organisation. So there's a huge responsibility on employers who value their staff, who value the service that they provide children and young people, being absolutely crystal clear with their new starters, including volunteers, to communicate their standards.
And I've got to say, how many people start a new job and on day one you get a stack of policies to read. Day two is then a stack of e-learning to do on the back of that. And yeah, this stack of policies and a tick list to say, yep, I've read this policy and understand it. And I always say to people, really try and avoid doing that. Obviously, there are some policies people have to read, but test that. Do you actually understand? Because I can honestly say, hand on heart, I've started some jobs before where I've been given a pile of policies to read and a tick list, and by about the third one, I'm glazing over and I'm skim reading it, going, yeah, that's fine, tick, move on to the next one. And actually, that doesn't benefit anybody, does it?
Many of us have been in that situation.
Absolutely. It's funny, it's kind of seen as the norm. It's completely kind of accepted that that's the norm, that's what happens. But everybody knows it's not effective, is it?
Well, I think you're failing children and young people. If you're committed to offering a high quality service to the children that you're supporting and providing that service to, you owe it to them to make sure that the individuals who you're going to take on working in your organisations, sharing your values as an organisation, your beliefs and the philosophy about how that service will be provided to children and young people.
And same with policies, I think sometimes. I think quite a lot of the time what I see are sort of model policies, template policies, which when you look at them have literally had the name at the top changed. And you read down through them sometimes, you think this is not fit for purpose. This doesn't fit you as an organisation. And that's always so crucial, isn't it? If you've got a policy there, it needs to be your policy. By all means, use templates. Templates are great starting points, but having them as a starting point and not the finish point, I think.
I often find myself describing policies as really being the standards that are expected or the expected behaviour of that organisation and all the different components of what they're expecting that adult to do as part of their job and fulfilling their job. The word policies is a word that doesn't, for me, define just how important that communication of what those expected standards are. And I suspect out there are many organisations that are failing to make sure that their people understand what those expectations are and those standards.
And we see that in whistleblowing policies sometimes. Either they're not there, or if they are there, people don't know about them. More importantly, they haven't got the trust, I guess, in them, in the whistleblowing policy in particular, on this topic, that actually if they raise something, that's going to be kind of treated seriously and acted in line with the policy.
Absolutely. It takes a brave person to blow the whistle, and the starting point is to have a policy that's well known amongst everyone, and to know who to go to and when to go to them, and to be reassured when you've taken a concern that you've been listened to and to be communicated with. They won't be privy to what goes on between management and the individual of concern. That's not their right to know that, but they are expected to be told that action has been taken, that it's not been ignored, their concern.
You've mentioned about some legislation around statutory guidance, and that's constantly changing, isn't it? Constantly evolving all the time. Here, you mentioned the Children Act right at the start of this. You mentioned working together to safeguard children, and how, to what extent, or how does that sort of affect your role? Because I'm thinking about some things that have come in over the years, like within keeping children safe in education. We mentioned the requirement for agencies earlier to have a low-level concerns policy and the importance of that. Have you seen the kind of the contact that people have with you over that time sort of change, or some of the demands on the service change because of the changes in legislation or guidance?
I think the child protection system is evolving, and quite rightly so. As we become more educated because of research that's undertaken on children and young people and how to help them to nurture them, to ensure they thrive, we have learning from rapid reviews and how to make practitioners and their engagement with young people more enhanced and to understand responsibilities. So there are a whole myriad of different happenings in the big wide world that impact on children and young people that quite rightly the child protection system, as I keep referring to it, should be taking on board and refining and revising and introducing new legislation, and with that the statutory guidance to help practitioners on the ground implement that legislation.
Do you find sometimes that may lead to uncertainty with people? I'm just thinking in terms of sort of picking up from like with the low-level concerns policy, sort of initially picking up this real uncertainty about what does this mean? What does this look like? What do I do with this now? And again, that sort of uncertainty then leading potentially to more demand on yourselves.
Well, I'd like to think I'm a reasonably educated, intelligent person. I lose the will to live after reading a few paragraphs of a piece of legislation, let alone understanding what it means and what it means for me in my professional role and how to implement it. So statutory guidance is there to go some of the way to interpreting that legislation, and then organisations create policies and procedures on the back of that. But by the time it gets to those of us at the coal face, we have a reasonably, hopefully, good understanding of what's being expected.
Sort of taking us back a little bit to the start of this, where we talked about the Sower murders, as they were known, the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and the sort of the inquiry that came out from that, and I think. Just going back to that for a moment, I know that sort of highlighted that policies and procedures are really important. They're great, but what underpins that and is more important potentially is that safe culture within agencies, and that being the real key around safeguarding children. And I know that's something that you've often talked about. What would you say were kind of some of those elements of having a safe culture or sort of how would you kind of recommend around developing a safe culture within agencies? What does that look like?
Well, it's interesting. The public inquiry following the deaths of Jessica and Holly, Sir Michael Bishard, introduced the need for, in schools, because that's where Ian Huntley was working as a caretaker in a secondary school, and Maxine Carr was a teaching assistant in a primary school. It was about the expectations of organisations around vetting and checking for recruitment purposes. There was a lot of criticism in that public inquiry about how Ian Huntley had been recruited, and the references or lack of references or the vagueness of the references that he received. It also saw a huge change in how we interpret data protection, because Ian Huntley had no less than a dozen very serious crimes that he'd been investigated for that he didn't get convicted. And the force area he'd previously lived in, which I think was Humberside, had incorrectly misinterpreted the data protection, and after a period of time had got rid of crucial information that would have identified a worrying pattern of behaviour. These are serious offences, raping girlfriends, that sort of thing, and that information never got passed through to the force area in Cambridgeshire, which is where Soham Village is located. So there's been a huge move towards helping organisations understand their responsibilities to employ people and put them through robust vetting and checking processes, hence what was CRB checks, now DBS checks, with barred information, reference checks, which include verbal references, having people on the interview panel who have done these one-day safer recruitment training. We've talked earlier about the importance of organisations having comprehensive induction processes that, as you say, go beyond just giving the person a pile of papers called policies and asking them to read it. having fit-for-purpose policies and procedures, having training delivered by suitably accredited trainers that's to a standard that meets the needs of those being employed, promoting good role modelling behaviour, so having senior managers who walk the walk and talk the talk, they get on out there and can be publicly seen interacting with children and young people, promoting how the expected way that they should be dealt with and respected.
And I think that often we see that sort of culture within organisations, certainly coming down from the top, I think quite often, and where that culture of around safeguarding isn't there right at the top, you do see that kind of cascading down, I think, across the organisation, don't you?
Well, you'd expect right from the top level of whatever the governance arrangements are for that organisation through to its CEO, aka head teacher, senior manager, whatever job title, and the senior management team, middle management. It is management and leadership that drives forward the culture.
And that culture of openness, transparency being so key to that, isn't it? And
clarity of role, giving capacity for those with responsibilities for safeguarding to do the role well.
I always say to people that I think sometimes one of the keys around having or developing and maintaining a safe culture is about not being afraid to have those conversations. Yeah, within your team meetings, what would you do if you had a concern? We talked about the whistleblowing policy earlier. What would you do if you had a concern about me? Let's talk about that. And just being open, talking about safeguarding. And I think the more that is talked about and communicated, the more it just kind of really develops that culture.
I mean, a good example of that is safe working practice, because that benefits volunteers, employees in the organisations. If everyone's communicating how to deal with a certain situation, certain circumstances, how to operate and work and interact with young people in a way that doesn't leave you vulnerable to spurious allegations, that's vital in terms of creating a robust safeguarding culture, as is self-reporting. The expectation of there being mutual trust and confidence between the employer and the employee is vital, and that from the employer's perspective would be that employees recognise when they perhaps have fallen short of the required standards of behaviour and report it to their line manager.
And that self-reporting, again, like I say, really crucial there. I'm going to give you an example actually that somebody gave me on some training I was doing a while back, which it was such a good example. I use it all the time now. And somebody said this was somebody who did a lot of one-to-one work with young people, quite often transported them in their car as part of their duties, part of their work. And they said to me, actually, there've been occasions where they've been driving along dual carriageway or motorway or something like that, and a young person in the front seat of the car, and they've gone to change gear, and they've accidentally touched somebody's knee, the young person's knee, and they were really clear, saying, actually, if that ever happened, or when that has happened, I've always self-reported that within my organisation. I've always let people know about that, and actually, when you pick that apart a little bit, completely innocent, completely low level. They've gone to change gear, not even, in fact, it's been very accidental, and it seems pretty small, incidental. But actually, if that person hadn't self-reported, and in a couple of weeks' time, that young person was talking to somebody saying, "Yeah, it was really weird the other day. We were driving along, and he started touching my knee in the car." Actually, how that might be sort of seen, but also bearing in mind that some of the young people we might be working with may have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives, and how that might be might be interpreted by then. And I thought that was a really good example to use, because it's completely innocent, but really important, and important they had the confidence to say, "Do you know what? I need to let you know that this has happened here."
That's a really good example, Steve, and it illustrates both from the young person and the adults their part in that. So for the young person, that can be triggering for them, as you say, if they've come from a familial abuse situation where touch is construed not to be a positive thing and actually has got some sort of sexual intent behind it. The ability for that young person to know who to go to share that concern, that they're encouraged to bring that concern forward. We know how difficult that can be. Us adults can try and make ourselves indispensable by being really busy, and we don't create that opportunity for young people and give them time to talk about their experiences. Young people struggle to communicate. They might use clumsy language or inappropriate colloquialisms that us adults need to be very careful not to be dismissive of, and that we really listen to them. That also contributes to creating a safeguarding culture. From the adult's perspective, it shows good awareness of how their actions, what they say, what they do, can be misconstrued. It also shows the adult understands the expectations of that organisation, its values. It shows responsibility by that adult, and it shows accountability. Really crucial parts of safeguarding culture, that people recognise their responsibilities and hold their hand up and show accountability. I'd like to think that most employers would be empathetic. We're working with humans, and we're complex beings.
You've had quite a long and illustrious career, obviously, within Somerset and beyond then as well. But is there anything that you're sort of particularly proud of, either from that you've been involved in, or you as a team have been involved in, or sort of any particular good sort of success stories?
So as a team, what we're particularly proud of is the fact that despite the fact we don't work directly with children and families, we see our service as having an important contribution with other agencies and organisations to identify individuals who may be unsuitable for whatever reason working with children and young people, and to plan to take action to mitigate any potential identified risk or eliminate that risk, whether that be through ceasing to use that volunteer, making a DBS referral to have them barred. So we see ourselves very much as integral to that child protection system. And I think it's also significant part of our role is that tenaciousness that we have to follow, and ensuring that whatever process is followed to investigate an adult of concern where risk have been identified, we're very tenacious at making sure that process is followed and seen through and an outcome reached for the young person's benefit and for their parents' benefit, carers' benefit, but also for the adult of concern. We neither want an adult to suffer detriment from a spurious, malicious allegation, and in terms of natural justice, they have a right to be subject to a process that recognises their feelings and their perspective.
No, that's great, and I know, and you guys do a fantastic job, and I'm not just blowing smoke when I say that. And I know that you are, as a team, very highly regarded and appreciated for not just the work that you do, but the advice that you give as well, which is really key. So, just to kind of round off on that, then, in terms of advice, what advice would you give, or kind of recommendations for any parents or caregivers or any professionals when it comes to recognising and reporting child safeguarding concerns? What kind of nugget of advice would you give people?
Know where to go. Most organisations providing services will have a procedure, and it's about identifying where to find that procedure and who to go to with a concern.
Thank you so much. Anthony, thank you. I know you've got a very, very busy schedule at the moment, so I really appreciate you taking a bit of time today to come along and talk to us.
You're welcome. Thanks, Dave.
So thank you so much. Great to talk to you, and great to finally get you in the studio for us to have a conversation. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Anthony. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
As always, If you'd like to find out more details on the topics discussed in today's episode, go to the SSCP website at somersetsafeguardingchildren.org.uk, where there's a dedicated Managing Allegations page. Now, in this episode, I mentioned some of the training that Anthony and Stacey are currently running through the SSCP, focused on understanding and managing low-level concerns, which is currently available to all education settings in Somerset. And you can find details to book your free space by visiting the SSCP training page or by clicking in the link in the description for this episode. As always, if you have any questions or comments arising from today's episode or would like to be involved in future episodes, we'd love you to get in touch with us at theppod@somerset.gov.uk. Once again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Anthony for joining us today, and as always, I'd like to thank you for listening. My name is Steve Maccabee, and I'm the Training Manager for the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership, and I look forward to you joining us again next time at the ThePPod.
Let's work together to help keep children safe.